Hello there and welcome back to Grass Me Up, the podcast all about Premier Lawns and Sports Turf. I'm Dr. Russell Sharp. At Utrema Limited, we make bespoke fertilisers, we make biostimulants, we make organic biopesticides. We also make liquid gypsum and clay drainer, which are probably our best-selling product in numbers of orders, and it goes mainly onto lawns and helps improve drainage and aeration without having to dig in. All other alternatives have to be dug in, so that's a really important product for us. So I thought I would share this podcast I did last year about flooding and drainage. It was focused on gardens and on farms because I have a couple of other podcasts on arable farming and horticulture. But I think the information there is relevant to anyone working on turf, especially because these products that we produce at Utrema don't have to be dug in and work instantly. So we do a deep dive on flooding and waterlogging in this episode and look at all different methods of controlling those issues, from mechanical through to product-based things. So have a listen, hope you enjoy it, and you wait around until the very end because I say probably one of the most stupid things I've ever said and lived to regret it. So have a listen to that. Thank you very much for listening. Enjoy the episode. Today's episode will be of particular interest to farmers, but also gardeners and greenkeepers, anyone with an equestrian paddock, basically even pot plant owners if you're living in a flat, because today's subject is flooding or waterlogging. And anyone who cultivates plants will have a problem with this. So we're going to do a really big deep dive into flooding and waterlogging. It's also going to be the podcast that I put out as a QR code when anyone orders any products from Utrema. They'll have this podcast will be directly linked by a QR code, because this has been a really big issue since autumn 2023 and all of 2024, because we've had an exceptional year for rainfall. And so at Utrema, we've been solving waterlogging more than any other problem this year. Of all the problems we've been solving for gardeners and farmers, this has been the one. So it's about time that we did a podcast about it. The reason I've been putting it off is because it's such a big subject. But if you like a really long format podcast, then this is going to be the one for you. So sit back and listen to me, my boring tone about flooding and waterlogging. So as I say, it's interesting to even like houseplant owners, because like people say, "Oh, what's wrong with my houseplant?" And 90% of all houseplants die from overwatering, not underwatering or being too cold or anything like this. You think about poinsettias, aloes, cacti, they all hate being overwatered, but people just want to kill them with kindness. So I always say, when it comes to indoor plants, check them for pest and disease every day if you want, but don't water them every day. Even some plants that originate in tropical rainforests, like African violets, can really, really hate any stagnant, stale water at the bottom of their pots, even though they live in African rainforests. So it's a problem for all types of plants. And so the differentiation between waterlogging and flooding is simply when the water rises above the surface of the soil. So you will get the same types of damage occurring in flooding and waterlogging because it's just a saturation of the soil with water. What can that be caused by? The main problem that we've been solving this year is clay soils, because clay soils have very, very small particle size. And not only that, they compact very easily, form what we call pans, cultivation pans, and that impedes the drainage to where the water would otherwise go down to the water table. And so that soil might normally, if it hadn't formed a pan, it might have actually drained away. But because of that, especially when there's a deluge, the water just can't get down fast enough. Obviously, flood waters coming into an area can also cause flooding, and just a prolonged period of wet weather as the water table rises, that can cause waterlogging and flooding. So the effects and the symptoms on crops, well, the main problem is not the amount of water. The main problem is it takes the air out of the soil. And without air in the soil, there's no oxygen in the soil. Now, if you put my feet in water, I could survive for a fairly long time with my feet submerged in water. Eventually, I'd probably get gangrene or trench foot if it was cold, but my feet would still stay alive for a very, very long time. That's very different in plants because plants don't have a circulatory system. They don't have a blood system that can take oxygen. Obviously, they've got the xylem and the phloem that can move sap around the plant. However, that's not moving oxygen. So plant cells need access to oxygen all around them. And in roots, if the air pores in the soil have been taken up by water, then they can't get access to oxygen. And that leads to some serious problems. Very serious problems. So in roots, it's called anaerobiosis, which is a great word. Anaerobiosis. We come up with some great words in this podcast, and that is one of them. And that leads, in the worst situation, killing off of the roots or even the whole plant. They can also damage them to the point where disease can get in. So in essence, it's a wounding as well. The rate of respiration in an actively growing root is actually quite high. And they can require anything up to 10 to 50% of all the sugars fixed by photosynthesis go into the roots and are respired there. So for that, you're obviously going to need a lot of oxygen. So what do plants do when they haven't got any oxygen around? They switch from aerobic respiration to anaerobic respiration. And the problem with this is, yes, it doesn't require any oxygen to do that. They can still respire, but it's only 7% as efficient. So they're wasting a lot of sugars by doing it. Furthermore, it creates ethanol. And ethanol, although you may like it in an alcoholic drink, it is toxic to living organisms. And as the ethanol levels increase, then the cells will start to die off. So anaerobic respiration is bad for plants. This has a knock-on effect on photosynthesis. So even though the leaves are not in the flooded roots, the photosynthetic rate drops dramatically. So if an apple tree is flooded for just 3 days, the photosynthetic rate drops to 1/5 of its unflooded rate that it would be going and photosynthesizing. So a massive impact there on crop health and eventually yield and quality. One of the common symptoms of flooding or waterlogging is patchy chlorosis, so spotty yellowing on the leaves rather than blanket chlorosis. And obviously, if you're reducing photosynthesis and respiration, then slower growth of the plants will also be observed. There are some notable and extreme exceptions to that slower growth, though. You'll get what's called epinasty in tomatoes, where the leaves just dramatically droop because the petioles have grown down. And then you get the exact opposite in plants that form rosettes type growth, like cabbages or Arabidopsis, stale cress, things like that, where they actually grow up what's called hyponasty. And that's thought to be an evolved reaction to flooding, where they want to get the leaves up and out above the flood waters. And the epinasty in tomatoes is due to trying to reduce transpiration, which is something we'll go on to in a second. So for some of these plants that actually increase or elongate their growth when flooded, cereals are particularly prone to this. And it's being bred out of a lot of cereals. So it has already been bred out of a lot of cereals because while it's a defense response to the flooding, the elongation actually increases lodging in cereal crops. So the flooding might have occurred several months before, but actually that elongated crop is then very prone to lodging. So it's been bred out of them. And so you won't find this response in most cereals nowadays. Some species will actually form what's called edema, or it's actually written OEDEMA. So I often refer to it as oedema. And just like in humans, where you get sort of water buildup in your tissues, water retention, edema can occur in plants, and in things like houseplants is very common. But any plant that's growing in low light conditions can get edema, where you get these bulgings of the tissues, of the leaves, of the stems, and that can lead to unsightly blemishes. And because they eventually fill with a sort of corky tissue, lignified tissue, and so you get like corky scab in apples. It's not such a problem in cereals. You don't really find edema, I don't think, in many grass species. For a lot of plants, one of the key problems with flooding and waterlogging is shallow rooting. This is particularly a problem of trees, where they can become uprooted in wind if they're in a flooded field. But again, in cereals, shallow rooting is not going to be good when it comes to lodging later on in the season. In tomatoes, you get something called adventitious roots forming on the stems. So you get roots forming even higher than where the root to shoot junction normally would be. Some people think, oh, great, my tomato plants are so healthy, they're forming roots on their stems. That's not the case. That means that you're overwatering your tomato plants. And then one of the major symptoms or problems with waterlogging is that transpiration, the movement of water through the stem into the leaves and out of the stomatal pores, completely stops in a waterlogged soil. So plants do not want to move sap around them when they are waterlogged. That might seem completely counter logical, because you think, well, they want to get rid of the water. Why don't they just transpire it all away? Why aren't plants pumping out water when they're flooded? And that's because to transpire all that water out requires respiration. And if they haven't got oxygen, they're not going to have enough oxygen and sugars to get rid of all the water in a flooded soil. So transpiration stops completely. The stomata close. Sap movement doesn't happen. Now, some plant tissues can carry on. The nutrient levels are high enough. They can move nutrients around the plants in the phloem, not the xylem, but calcium can't move. If the xylem's not moving, the plants will become calcium deficient. And so that's why you see plants that either are droughted, they don't get enough water, or flooded, suffering from calcium deficiency. So that can be, depending on your crop, there will be a key distinguishing feature of calcium deficiency, very easily normally to identify. It's normally a decaying, a blackness, almost like a frostbite of the tissue. So in tomatoes, the classic example is blossom end rot and dead hearts of celery and lettuce. I'm not sure what it is in cereals, but it'll be something similar. And so that's a key issue. If flooding and waterlogging is occurring in the winter, then that's not so much of an issue, because the plants are normally dormant. They don't need as much oxygen. They only need a tiny, tiny fraction of the amount of oxygen. And therefore, some plants can more than adequately deal with flooding during the winter. But if it comes to the summer, then that's where the issue is, because those roots are transpiring. They can't be turned off, the respiration at will. And so you're going to get serious issues. And the other reason that summer flooding is particularly bad is because you will kill off the beneficial microbes that are living in the soil. And we know that the beneficial microbes, the microbiome in the soil, is extremely important for plant and soil health. And without them, and with a change to less beneficial microbes, then we get all sorts of problems occurring in a flooded soil. So in the summer, when these microbes are metabolizing, there's lots of life in the soil. There's as much life in the soil in a sheep field as there is sheep in the field. That's one example. And it's a major issue for every crop, but especially legume crops, because as we know, legumes have nodules on their roots, and they are filled with rhizobium bacteria, and these are very, very intolerant of flooding, and nitrogen fixation will not happen in a legume crop, and you'll get a failure of that crop. So they need oxygen to respire at all times. So you'll get the death of all these aerobic bacteria, but you'll also get the stimulation of anaerobic bacteria that, on the whole, are going to be doing negative things when it comes to plant health. So they'll lead into the breakdown of organic matter. And then they'll be creating it into compounds that are directly toxic to plant health, like hydrogen sulfide and butyric acid. And they can also produce compounds that are directly toxic to the beneficial microbes as well. So you get that switch from beneficial to the nasty anaerobes. And with them, they'll also produce a nasty smell. And so not only the fact that your plants are going to be harmed, you will be, well, not say harmed, but mildly dissatisfied with bad smells leaking out of your waterlogged or compacted soils. As with most pest diseases and problems, seedlings are going to be more prone to problems than established plants. So a seedling can die within a few days of being flooded, whereas an established tree could take a year or two to die. And as I say, in the summer, that problem is going to be worse than in the winter. But for some garden plants, winter flooding is the worst that can happen. So especially the half-hardy shrubs. So you've got plants that you might plant in your garden and you think it grows down south, it'll be fine up here in Yorkshire, like Diosma, Corokia, Parahebe, and Libertia. Plants I've seen in botanical gardens, but I've never actually planted in my garden itself. I think some of these are from New Zealand and places like that, especially Parahebe. That sounds like it's from New Zealand. And they may tolerate frost, but if it's very wet, they're not going to tolerate frosty, waterlogged gardens, so they'll soon succumb to that. One of the common factors you might find in a waterlogged plant is leaf drop. And that's because when you get those waterlogged soils, you get a big burst of ethylene. And ethylene leads to leaf abscission. Okay, that's also what stops roots growing. And ethylene also leads to the formation of aerenchema. And aerenchema are specialized tissues in roots that are full of air rather than, cytoplasmic fluids or starch, things like that. So that you've got air there in the roots, and that allows the plant to adapt to the harmful effects of flooding. But obviously when the floodwaters are removed, then the aerenchema, that can struggle to survive in non-flooded soils. So that's a big problem. And then there's a big issue around nutrient leaching or washing away of nutrients and the conversion of nutrients to unwanted compounds. So if there are anaerobic conditions in the soil, if it's flooded or compacted, then nitrates will be reduced by those anaerobic bacteria into what eventually nitrogen gas. So your fertilizer will go into the air, and that is a loss, and that's denitrification. And that process can occur remarkably quickly, with some soils able to lose pretty much all their nitrates in 2 days in a flooded soil. So that's alarming, especially if you're a horticulturalist who's applying their nitrogen as the form of nitrates as standard. Then these anaerobic bacteria will also convert potassium, phosphorus, iron, and manganese into different forms of the compounds. They do this because they're an energy source, so they'll reduce them down, what's called chemical reduction. Sometimes this makes them more soluble, which is good for a plant perspective if the plant was healthy. But what's going to happen is when they're soluble, when the floodwaters recede, those nutrients go with the water away from the plant, and then when the plant becomes healthy again, they're no longer available. So that's a big problem. And then you can also get the issue where these anaerobic bacteria form a coat, a biofilm around the roots and stop absorption of nutrients and water and just get in the way, prevent the absorption of oxygen again. So this biofilm like you get on taps, so if you haven't cleaned your taps in your kitchen or in your bathroom, these biofilms, these can form on plant roots as well when anaerobic conditions are prevalent. You also get the creation of toxins and the solubilization of toxins that were already in the soil. So some toxins are present in the soil, but the plant doesn't actually get access to them because they're in insoluble forms. And then other times, the microbes can actually create the toxins themselves. So this is especially a problem in acidic soils, and you can get the formation of soluble heavy metals like selenium. Selenium is required by humans in a very small amount, but if you in less than very small amounts, in more than very small amounts, selenium becomes toxic. It's a heavy metal. Aluminium doesn't sound like it should be a toxic element, but it is, especially to plants. It's very toxic. Arsenic, toxic to plants and humans. Chromium, fluoride, lead, mercury, cadmium. They may have all been present in an insoluble form, i.e. locked up, but then these elements become available when the conditions become anaerobic. So they can become toxic to the plant, but they can also be taken up into the crop, and when you eat them, you can take them up as well, and they're sort of bioaccumulating heavy metals. The anaerobic bacteria, as we said, they can form nasty chemicals from the organic matter in the soil. They can form hydrocarbon gases, acetic acid, all types of carboxylic acids, and ethylene, which is the gaseous hormone that often has a deleterious effect on plant growth, yield, and all those sorts of things. So that's a big issue. And one very underlooked problem of flooded soils is the transport of pests and pathogens. So very common ones are what we call the oomycetes with a double O. Things like Phytophthora and Pythium, they can travel in water and spreading water. And so if you've got a film of water on your soil, they're going to travel faster. Botrytis, especially a problem on ornamental nurseries, but they get something called running botrytis where the pot plants, or where the water flows, they get this botrytis going between them. But so I said phytophthora root rot, mildews can flow in floodwaters. Peach leaf curl in an orchard can travel in floodwaters. So, and it can even flush out rats. So if you're in a garden or in a shed and you've got floodwaters, or even in an agricultural situation in an arable field, that rats can be flushed out by large-scale flooding. Even some human diseases can spread from sewage into your area if you're not careful. You see that in floodwaters. We've seen massive flooding now in Spain, and that will be a key thing for the health departments there, is preventing human disease from spreading. Weeds, you might get spread of weed seeds, I suppose, but the key problem with weeds is when it comes to flooding, prolonged flooding, is you get the establishment of weeds that love flooded soils. But the good news is you can use your knowledge of these species to identify where it might be prone to flooding, because you'll see these species again and again and again. So the classic example is horsetails. They love an allotment, horsetails, and if you see a lot of horsetails around, you know that it's going to be flooded. Bracken, obviously, mosses, plantains, plantago, they love flooded soils, and you'll see them on flooded or compacted soils. Creeping buttercup loves wet conditions, and you will find pineapple plant. It's obviously not related to pineapples; it's an alien species, but it grows particularly well in where there's high nutrient levels and compacted soils. So especially around the gates where cattle congregate when they're going between fields, you'll see pineapple plant. And that's why it grows there, because it's compacted, it's waterlogged, and it's high in nutrients because of all the cows doing their business. So then you will get the breakdown of soil structure in flooded soils. As we've said, you'll get you'll get the crumb structure of a great soil, a really healthy soil. Even if it's clay, can form a lovely crumb structure, but you get a breakdown of soil structure, and you'll get pans forming, like thick layers, horizontal layers that further impede drainage. And we'll go on to that in a second, why that occurs. Waterlogging can also inhibit seed germination, and because they remove the oxygen that's required for germination. For germination, you require heat, water, oxygen. What else do you need? I think that's about it, really, isn't it? You don't need light. You don't need CO2, but you do need oxygen. And so seeds will not germinate without oxygen. And so if you've got a flooded arable field, you might get delayed germination. So let's go on to treatment now. Now, I've always said to anyone who asks me about flooded soils, don't do anything when the soil is wet. In a horticultural situation, that is true. Don't do anything when it's wet, because you will get the formation of pans. If you try and dig, or worst case scenario, rotivate your garden or your allotment or your horticultural nursery, or even your arable field when the soil is wet, because you'll get the formation of this pan where the bottom layer squeezes down and forms that pan that can't, when it dries, the water will not be able to get through. However, I was out spraying. I wasn't spraying. I was seeing a customer today who's spraying our blackgrass pathogen spores. And we're talking about mole ploughing, because mole ploughing is something I know helps with drainage, but I have no clue about what mole plough does. And he was explaining to me what the mole plough does. And I was saying, what conditions shouldn't you mole plough in? And he said dry weather and dry soils. And that's because the mole plough has to create a sort of a tunnel for the water to drain into, and that tunnel, the roof of that tunnel will not stand up if the soil is too dry. So mole ploughing is the one thing you can do if the soil is wet. But when we go into the other treatments, always think about don't do it when it's wet. Obviously, thyme is a great treatment for flooded soils. Eventually, they will, hopefully, unless you're on the floodplain, should eventually drain away. You can install drains with differing degrees of success. Often you get recommended to install, in a garden situation, French drains. However, the water's got to have somewhere to go, and they are very inconsistent whether they work or not, and they cost a lot of money as well. So I'd do everything but install a French drain. To use that as the last option. You can do something called geoinjection, where you inject air into the soil. That works especially around established trees where there's been compaction. But in a garden, more and more people are doing geoinjection. It's probably not at agricultural scale. It's probably not going to be feasible. Obviously, ploughing can be an issue. Obviously, min-till, no-till, you're not going to be ploughing. So the use of crops or cover crops or break crops that have very deep root systems that will add organic matter and help build up soil structure at depth will be key there. Okay, we talked about mole ploughs, ditches, digging ditches. It's not sexy work. It's not interesting, but digging a ditch and maintaining the ditch will be important. The application of lime. So if you're trying to raise the pH of your soil, then lime is a great product to use. It will slowly work to flocculate the soil. And flocculate means the congregation of clay particles around the calcium molecule. So lime is calcium carbonate from limestone. It's ground up limestone. And adding calcium really helps with that, and that really does improve drainage. Now, the lime also increases your pH. So if you've not got a acidic soil, then you can also add gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, and that will also flocculate your soil. However, gypsum comes in all different shapes and sizes. It's plasterboard, but plasterboard comes with fungicides in it, and it's in big chunks. And so I'd never advise applying plasterboard, because when that soil becomes flooded again, you can get anaerobic bacteria working on the sulfur and producing nasty hydrogen sulfide gas. So if you can use finely ground gypsum on agricultural soil, that's great. However, there are disadvantages of gypsum and lime, as it only works where it's applied, so it needs to be worked in. So if you're only applying it to the top centimetre, it's only going to work there. It's very cheap and cheerful, lime and to some extent gypsum. And there are limits about how much you can apply per hectare as well. So at Utrema, we have a different approach, and we created a product called liquid gypsum. And that's because at Utrema, we have a couple of specialities. We have specialities around biopesticides, but we also have a speciality around getting things into solution that shouldn't normally be possible. So if you think about our phosphorus liberator product, that's a great product about getting phosphorus that shouldn't normally be soluble in the soil into solution. And our liquid gold product, which is the fertilizer that contains every single essential plant nutrient, that shouldn't be possible, but our unique technology allows that. And the same with liquid gypsum. Gypsum's not normally soluble into a solution. However, we've managed that, and we marketed this for like min-till, no-till farmers who weren't ploughing, who wanted to improve the drainage on their soils and add some calcium and sulfur at the same time. However, this year, 2023, we've seen really good effects on golf courses and domestic gardens. And so if you've seen our Facebook ads, we've been pushing this one really hard, and we've had really good feedback from growers and gardeners, people on their lawns who've said that they've transformed their gardens. Obviously, the application rate in a domestic garden is far, far higher. So we say in an arable situation where we're direct drilling or trickling in the product, we're doing 20 litres per hectare, whereas in a domestic situation, we're applying about 20 litres for 500 square metres. But this product has, kept us buoyant this year, because sales of other fertilizers and biostimulants have been down. And so liquid gypsum's really been good, and the feedback's been tremendous. And so it's a very big part of our business now is solving flooding and waterlogging in domestic gardens.
So the reason liquid gypsum has been such a success for domestic gardeners is that it acts instantly, and so you don't need to wait around. It's 2,000 times more instantly active than powdered granular gypsum. But the main reason it works so well in sort of domestic lawn situations is you don't need to dig into the soil. So you don't need to plough or dig your soil to actually get it down into the subsoil and flocculate the clay. That's a big issue. I don't have the time to be digging gypsum and lime into my back garden, and most people don't. So the ability to sort of drive it down on the day of application to where it's needed, it means it's a very useful tool for flocculation. So you can, if you've got issues, if you've got a new build property and the top layer is thick and crusted with clay, it's got a big cap, you can apply it to the surface with a small amount of water and it'll work there. Or if you've got a distinct layer of clay further down in the topsoil or even in the subsoil, you can put the sprinklers on and get it down there, as long as it gets down on the day of application. then that's good. And as long as the soil's not too wet, so it's not a magic bullet, it doesn't instantly drain waterlogged soils. You apply it when the soil's dry, so that when you apply it to the soil, it's soaked into the clay. So it doesn't have to be bone dry, but just not waterlogged. It goes into the clay and flocculates it. And then when there's the next deluge, that's when you see an effect. So that could be a min-till, no-till farm. That could be a golf course or a domestic garden. You apply it when the soil's fairly dry, any time of year, doesn't matter if it's winter or summer. And then when there's a next deluge, you see far better drainage. And the feedback on that has been tremendous, really. You just look at our Facebook page, loads of people raving about it. So we're really happy with that.
Other calcium products can help with this. However, do not apply calcium nitrate. You'll struggle to get hold of calcium nitrate because it's an explosive. And also, you're adding nitrate. And we've already talked about how nitrate can lead to that, can be just utilized by those non-beneficial anaerobic bacteria. And so that's the worst case scenario, is applying calcium nitrate. And also that nitrate will leach into the groundwater and lead to algal blooms further down in the system. So don't be doing that. Another great one is applying organic matter. If you've got a source of organic matter, apply it to your fields, to your beds, anything but your lawn. Don't apply organic matter to your lawn because it can interfere with, obviously, the machinery and the growth of the grass plant, and it can actually be counterproductive in lawns. But everywhere else, organic matter and mulches are obviously brilliant for just improving soil health in any way. If you've got dry soils or wet soils or clay soils or sandy soils, organic matter solves them all, and it stimulates beneficial microbes. It's brilliant. I never, ever give the council my green waste bin. I was like, why would I give that away? I want that for my garden. It's like, and then they say, oh, we can pay, you have to pay them then to take away your green waste. It's like, no way. I'm having that for compost. It's going in my wormery. So, So organic matter is great. And mycorrhizae, if you've got a perennial crop or even some annual crops, mycorrhizae have now been found to be useful in mitigating the effects of flooding. So research in Japan in the early 2000s found that plants were more flood tolerant if they were in partnership with the mycorrhizae fungi. So another win for mycorrhizae and beneficial microbes there over conventional chemistry. The reason why mycorrhizae could be good in flooded soils is they could be sort of warding off and attacking those anaerobic bacteria that would be otherwise forming a biofilm around the plant root, trying to get hold of the plant root. So, and the pathogens that would otherwise be trying to attack the plant in those when it's weakened in a flooded system. So mycorrhizae, brilliant for that reason, potentially. How can you mitigate against compaction and flooding? Obviously, you can't stop it raining. You can prevent compaction, though. Obviously, not working the land when it's wet, forming those pans, reducing your tire pressures, increasing your surface area when you're going on the land. So, you'll see tractors with very large wheels, and that's for that reason, to prevent compaction. There are a number of benefits to flooding, and I'm going to go through these now because they're minor. They're all very minor, but they are very interesting. So despite all the problems listed, there are some benefits. It's been used by some farms in Lincolnshire to suffocate harmful potato cyst nematodes in infested soils. So they've actively flooded certain fields to kill them. So nematodes need water to sort of swim and live in it, but if they're flooded, they die straight away. So, however, to use that as a sort of widespread strategy of flooding your soils to control nematodes, it's risky, and the only people I know who do it are very advanced nematologists. Probably might be one for organic potato growers, for example, who can't use nematicides. Nematicides are pretty horrible chemicals traditionally because nematodes are animals. The way you kill them is not just insecticides, it's other stuff like that. The greater solubility of iron in a flooded soil could potentially be seen as a benefit. However, once again, it's hard to control it, and that iron will be washed away if you're not careful. So it could just be leached away. A Spanish study in the 1980s found that stock plants, if they were flooded for 48 hours before cuttings were taken from them, could improve how successful the cuttings were. However, that was a very short and controlled waterlogging. It wasn't just the flooded fields they went out and picked them from. Prolonged and uncontrolled waterlogging will probably be detrimental to the stock plants and the cutting. There are a couple of crop plants that do
thrive or actually are grown in waterlogged soils. So we think of rice, but rice is grown in paddy fields, but that water quickly subsides, it's used up through the growth of the plant. They're not constantly in flooded conditions, rice plants. But Chinese water chestnut is, you eat the edible corms. I've grown Chinese water chestnut hydroponically, or tried to. It wasn't a great success, but they will grow in waterlogged conditions. Water spinach is not a spinach. It's related to morning glory, that ornamental plant, the annual Ipomea aquatica. That produces edible foliage, and so that water spinach and water chestnut are two crops that can be grown in waterlogged conditions, and both grown in Asia and not very popular in Western cuisine. In fact, this is where it gets pretty Asian, because Japanese chefs also make use of a lot of other what we call riparian species that live along rivers, like giant butterbur, which is related to the common butterbur that grows alongside rivers in the British Isles. However, both of those species contain toxic alkaloid chemicals considered to be harmful if ingested. And that often, that when it comes to obscure Asian vegetables, being slightly toxic is not often considered that harmful. I can give you a lot of examples of plants like that. So common butterbur is one you could potentially harvest if you didn't mind being poisoned. American cranberry, they're actively encouraged flooding in the winter. However, the flooding is used to protect the tender shrubs from frost damage. And so they wouldn't be flooded in the summer, because obviously that respiration in the roots needs to occur. Mints are another example of edible plants that thrive in wet soils. But it's a bit of a catch-22 when it comes to mints, because they thrive in damp conditions, but they then become invasive weeds. And so you never want to plant out mint anywhere where you need to get them out of anytime soon. So, back when I was about 16, I had a job which was just weeding mint from this lady's house in a garden. And she paid me a good hourly wage, and the mint just kept on coming back. And so it was a great job, because it was just, this mint was self-propagating and it was never going anywhere. I think maybe a weed killer would have been the best option eventually. But yeah, mint grows there. Then we come to one of my favourite plants, wasabi. Now, if you know Utrema, our company is called Utrema, and that is the scientific name for wasabi. So you must know that it's an important plant to everyone here. And we've grown hundreds and hundreds of plants of wasabi, and common knowledge says that wasabi has to be grown in waterlogged conditions, in rivers. It doesn't. It'll grow perfectly well in normal conditions. You just can't let the plant get dry. So it will tolerate waterlogged conditions if it's flowing. So it won't tolerate stagnant wet conditions. And that's one of the problems most people come when it comes to growing wasabi. And people say, oh, it's the hardest plant in the world to grow. It's not. It's a very easy plant to grow as long as you don't let it dry out and get too hot. One plant that does love wet conditions is liquid amber. And that's the scientific name for it, actually, liquid amber. It sounds like it should be the common English name for it, but it's actually the scientific name. The common name is sweet gum, I think. It looks like the beauty of liquid amber is it looks like a maple, a really ornate Japanese maple, but it's flooding tolerant, it's drought tolerant, it's wind tolerant. It will grow anywhere, and it will produce amazing autumn colours. So we get a lot of comments on Facebook, especially from right-wing people for some reason, with Britain First or Reform UK or Don't Be Vaccinated. And they always put a comment saying, oh, sick of all these chemicals when it comes to liquid gypsum, just plant a willow tree in your garden. I'm like, yeah. Who wants a gigantic willow tree in their garden subsiding their foundations? You're an idiot. Plant a small liquid amber tree. That will tolerate flooded conditions, and it will suck up a lot of water, and it won't grow ridiculously big like a willow tree and look horrible and produce aphids that will produce honeydew on your car and things like that. So yeah, if you don't like liquid amber, you could plant a swamp cypress, which sounds like a horrible plant, but it's actually really nice. I love swamp cypress. If you go to Kew Gardens or any well-established botanical gardens, you'll often find swamp cypress. They have these knees the knees are the roots that come out of the ground, go back in. And common theory says that they've evolved these knees to take oxygen down to the roots, and the parenchyma allows the air to flow down to the roots of the plant, and that's why it can tolerate these flooded conditions. However,
one scientist once chainsawed all the knees off a swamp cypress plant, or about 10 of them, and the plant showed no difference in its flood intolerance and carried on growing without its knees. So there is some debate on what swamp cypress knees do. So yeah, completely unrelated to growing cereals and arable crops, but I think that's interesting that some scientists decided, I'm going to get a chainsaw out. It's a bit like that the scientists that go up to, or used to go up to the bristlecone pines in America, the oldest trees in the world, and chop them down so they could count how old they were. And you're like, well, that's great. That was the oldest tree in the world. Congratulations, you've chainsawed it down. It's a bit destructive. Probably one of those scientific studies you should have to have written consent to do beforehand. So, yeah. One final benefit of flooding, especially in arable situations, is that you could, if a river bursts its banks, then you could get alluvium deposits forming, and there's minerals from the river can dump serious amounts of extra soil and nutrients back onto your farmland. However, they could also be dumping toxins from sewage works onto your ground because the local water companies decided that would be an opportune moment to allow a load of sewage to flow in, and you could have horrible, wet wipes all over and worse all over your land. So traditionally, alluvial deposits were a great thing. Now, not so much. And also, a flood could take your soil away. So we've seen the recent floods in Spain, and they weren't crystal clear waters flowing down those streets. That was clay soil, iron-rich clay in the water that had been taken off land. So it's, could be good, could be bad. And obviously, we've seen those fields flooded in Lincolnshire, and they've been flooded for nearly a year now because the river burst its banks and wasn't repaired. And obviously, you've losing crops for months and months and months. And I think the addition of a small amount of extra soil to this wouldn't be, paying dividends in the long term.
One final point to ponder is, has the recent really wet weather in late 2023 and 2024 been an anomaly? Is it a one-off, or is it the new normal, as the phrase goes nowadays? If it's the new normal, then farming practices, and a lot of practices will have to change dramatically, because the current farming practices with this amount of water would be unsustainable. Yields are down significantly this year, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll have a much drier 2025.
So there you go. That was me, the idiot, Dr. Russell Sharp, last year, saying I wished for a drier 2025. And look what we got, a stupidly dry year. So yeah, be careful what you wish for, people. I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you think I've missed out anything that's specific to lawns, turf, sports turf, then I'm more than happy to do a follow-up episode. As always, the only thing that I beg you is that you do an Apple podcast review, because that shoots me up the charts and helps grow the podcast. Reviews on any other podcast provider don't really do anything. It's only Apple. So if you're not listening on Apple, just chill out, relax, and wait for the next episode. Thank you very much for listening, and until next time, goodbye.